Evening. My name is Gresham. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Norfolk Conservatives, and on behalf of the entire committee, I'd like to welcome you here tonight and thank you all for attending. It's great to see a room of so many people wanting to learn more about Brexit. Just some housekeeping points before we start. The loos are just through there and to the left, but if you could go out through the back door so as not to disturb the speakers, that would be great. There isn't a fire alarm plan, so hopefully we'll be fine, but if it does go off, the assembly point is just in the car park, which you've all come up through, but we'll all lead you down. And could I ask you all now to please just make sure your mobile phones are on silent so that we don't have any funny ringing noises through the event. As you can see, there is a speaker not here yet. James Cleverly has just been caught in a little bit of traffic, but will be with us in 15 minutes, so we do have a full panel. We've got some wonderful speakers for you tonight, and hopefully the event will give you the opportunity to have all your questions about Brexit answered. The lineup might look a little different to you than the flyer. Unfortunately, Syed Kamal had some personal issues that meant he was unable to join us, but we have a wonderful replacement in Diane James MEP, who has kindly stepped in to make sure that we all have the inside scoop on the European Parliament. Our four speakers are Diane James MEP, James Cleverly MP, who will be here soon, Baron Goodyear of Northwood, and Martin Howe QC. I will be asking each panellist to speak for around 10 minutes about their views on the opportunities, risks and issues around Brexit, and then we will have an hour for Q&A. So please do think about questions. I will make sure you have an opportunity to ask everything you've ever wanted to ask, and fortunately I don't have to answer them. So, each of the speakers comes from a very different background. I'll introduce each of them before they speak so you can hear a bit more about them, but they will be able to shed light on particular viewpoints for London, the city, Parliament and the legal perspective. Before we start, I'd like to ask everyone to join me in a minute's silence to commemorate the brave policeman Keith Palmer and the other victims who were tragically murdered in the terror attack on Parliament yesterday. May they rest in peace. Thank you. Diane James MEP has worked in the healthcare sector for more than 30 years. She was elected as an MEP for UKIP in 2014 for the South East of England and was appointed Home Affairs and Justice spokesman. Diane was elected leader of UKIP in September 2016 and resigned from the party later that year. She currently sits as an independent MEP. She currently sits on the European Parliament's Constitutional Affairs Committee. So please welcome Diane James.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and thank you very much. I do hope you'll excuse the fact that UKIP was even mentioned this evening. Well, let me start with a couple of comments, which I'm sure maybe some of you have heard before, but I think really put into context what Brexit actually means for the United Kingdom. Now, the first is by a comment made by Jean Monnet, one of the founding fathers of the European Union back in the early 50s, actually before I was born, but that's beside the point. And his words were as follows: Europe's nations should be led towards the superstate without their people understanding what is happening. This can be achieved in successive steps each disguised as being an economic purpose, but, and I emphasise the but, which will irreversibly lead to a federation. And that federation has come about to actually arrive at what I call a totalitarian EU state. And by way of example, this is the sort of material that we as MEPs are provided with in the Parliament, in Brussels and in Strasbourg. This happens to be the briefing paper on the European idea and format for the European CV, curriculum vitae, which every single individual seeking a job somewhere in the European Union must address and must abide by. Put into context, ladies and gentlemen, the European Union feels that its powers actually extend to devising the pro forma for a curriculum vitae, and that gives you some idea why I actually believe fundamentally in the accusation and statement of a totalitarian state. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev, some decades later, went on to make the following comment. The most puzzling development in politics during the last decade is the apparent determination of Western European leaders to recreate the Soviet Union in Europe. And of course, we all know what happened to the USSR, and maybe Brexit is at the beginning of that. But can I also make plain, I don't actually want to see the demise of the European Union. I really don't. I'd like to see it succeed. What I'm though absolutely sure of is that the United Kingdom has made the very, very best decision in terms of its future, in terms of leaving and the vote that we had last June. Now, I'm a member of the European Parliament. I'm one of 73 United Kingdom MEPs, and I sit as a non-attached. There are 751 MEPs currently, representing the 28 member states. And for the mathematicians amongst you still on the ball, had your caffeine fix in the last 60 minutes, I'm sure you'll realise that in terms of United Kingdom clout, we cannot even muster 10% of the vote in the Parliament. It wouldn't matter if every single United Kingdom MEP dropped its political affiliation, decided to vote en bloc, we cannot do anything. And to add to the issues in terms of voting power, voting influence, voting clout, we've had in the Parliament now for some time qualified majority voting. Now this means that if 55% of the MEPs vote, that approximates towards 15 of the member states, but equates to 65% of the European Union population. If that's the result in a particular voting scenario, that vote will go through. So put those two elements together, less than 10% of the vote and the issue of QMV, and that shows you actually how little influence the United Kingdom has in the European Union Parliament chamber. But I wish I could stand before you and actually say, I've got some power. Now, I can remember during the referendum campaign, I joined Gerald Howarth MP in Aldershot, Conservative MP down there, very, very good speaker. And he opened his speech by saying, welcome to my constituency. And I followed and said, Gerald, do forgive me, I'm going to correct you. Welcome to my constituency. Because I'm an MEP that represents the 10 counties here in the southeast. But in terms of what I can actually do in the Parliament, unlike Gerald and unlike other MPs, is actually pretty nothing, pretty nil. I cannot introduce a private member's bill. I cannot do anything other than ask the Parliament, via the Parliament system, to rethink the proposal in front of me. No MEP can introduce or reject. They can abstain on a vote, but they can't actually do anything in terms of influencing decisions that are made by the Council and the Commission, and increasingly in a situation which is referred to as trialogue. Trialogue is probably something that is best remembered in terms of the USSR stance on voting, as in secret, no public disclosure, no information released whatsoever, no scrutiny, absolutely nothing happens. The decision merely and the recommendation comes to Parliament, and all we can do is sit there and effectively vote on it We can decide to abstain individually, but we can't turn it round and we can't refuse it. So ultimately, the Parliament, in terms of this system, if you like, and the structure, is increasingly powerless. It was introduced back in the 70s as a basis of trying to give what I call a democratic facade to the European Union. It's certainly done that. There is more uptake in terms of voter engagement in the other member states than we've ever seen here in the United Kingdom. And that's because voters there seem to think that they're actually bringing some form of democracy to the Parliament and to the European Union system. I think with grateful thanks to everybody who voted in the Brexit campaign, the United Kingdom saw that it was not the case. But just to remind you, so that you're quite clear as to what the components are of the decision-making process, you've got the Council, that's the key authoritative body, and that is in effect also checked with the Council of Ministers. This is where the member states, such as Theresa May, Angela Merkel, those sorts of people get together on a monthly basis, really just to test and discuss some of the aspects that the European Union has got coming forward. And the individual that heads that is Mr. Tusk, a former Prime Minister of Poland, recently just returned to his role despite his own country voting against him holding that position. Then you have the Commission, that's effectively the executive arm. That's the one that appoints all of the portfolio holders or the Director Generals and such, and actually principally takes care of the legislation as it comes through. Then you come down to my tier in the Parliament, all 751 of us. We're meant to exercise democratic control. We're also meant to have, would you believe, budgetary oversight. Well, I can tell you, we refused last year's EU budget, and did that mean anything? No, they're still going to spend an awful lot of money over the current year and for the remaining 2.5 years, money that, quite frankly, the EU does not have, I might add. Other arms, though, that you might be familiar with, terms, Court of Justice, based in Luxembourg. That's the one that interprets EU law and makes sure it's applied across every member state, including the United Kingdom. European Central Bank, headed by Mr. Draghi. I'm sure you've all read about the ECB and the problems there in terms of monetary policy. And then, would you believe it, the Court of Auditors. Yes, I sort of took a bit of a gulp at that one as well. Auditors, I'm sure you're again familiar. For 22 years now, the accounts effectively for the European Union have been passed with a qualified statement. That is code for any accountants among you that we don't pass them, but we realise we've got to let it go through, but we're going to put it through with a huge number of question marks against it. So this is not what I call a clean, open, transparent, democratic body. It's as simple as that. And thankfully, as I say, the decision was made by the United Kingdom to leave last year. What is the sentiment like in the Parliament, in the Commission, in the Council, effectively in Strasbourg, in Brussels and Luxembourg at the moment? Quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, it's not very nice. That's the polite way of putting it. The response from the other 20 member states, the response from the bureaucratic system within the Parliament, the Commission, etc., is if we are tough enough on the United Kingdom, if we prolong the negotiations long enough, if we issue enough penalties, enough threats, enough, if you like, revenge tactics, the United Kingdom will be brought to heel. It will either have a second referendum, or quite frankly, the negotiations will go on for so long that both parties will lose interest and nothing will actually be achieved. And I see this constantly in terms of the committee that I'm a member of. We meet now literally once a fortnight. It used to be roughly once every 6 weeks, but it's become a very, very important committee. And every single time, the European Union has invited 2 or 3 supposed expert speakers. And I've got no problem with experts, by the way, don't think that's the case. But these are individuals and they've been given one and one only remit, which is tell everybody, reinforce everybody how bad the decision that the United Kingdom has taken and how best can the European Union act to actually get that decision overturned. And this Tuesday, when we had AFCO on Tuesday morning, we had 2 visiting lawyers from Spain. My apologies to the legal profession. But they issued all of what I call the typical threats about citizens' rights, about freedom of movement, about what was going to happen to expats living in European member states, pensioners, for instance, in Spain, cross-border traffic between Gibraltar and Spain, issues such as that. And when I asked my questions, these were the following comments that came back. Gibraltar's undergoing a period of decolonisation, but that Brexit will actually help that. So that's their view on the relationship between Gibraltar and the United Kingdom, which I found amazing. And if you can bear in mind, Gibraltar joined the European Union at the same time as the United Kingdom, and therefore the issue of Brexit directly impacts on them. But then they went into what I call this constant threat, this constant, everything's going to hell in a basket, and the United Kingdom is going to be in a really, really terrible position. And one of the comments I then made was, look, this is all conjecture. It is all conjecture. I actually admire the Prime Minister. I may not be a member of the Conservative Party, but in terms of negotiating strategy and having been a member of a board and having chaired boards and such, when you're in or about to approach negotiations, you do not play your cards. You actually formulate your negotiating strategy, you put together your detail, and you drip feed the detail according to the response that you get from effectively your opponent or your opposition. It's interesting that the stance the European Union has taken at the moment is one of really dramatic statements. 45 euro fees if the United Kingdom resident wants to go to the European member states. Today, Mr. Barnier suggesting that air traffic control will be blocked, that we'll have aircraft circling over the United Kingdom unable to land, that we'll have border controls which will lead to huge queues of lorries unable to get on ferries, get into the tunnel on both sides. I mean, this is the sort of detail that they are deploying. And may I say, I think it's detailed, it's tactical. It's trying to gauge and trying to draw information out of the government's negotiating team. And all credit to the likes of Liam Fox and others that they haven't given away anything. And from my point of view, they don't need to, because the United Kingdom holds the upper hand in this particular negotiation, and long may that continue. What do I hope the Prime Minister will do going forward? We've obviously only been given 10 minutes, so I've skated through stuff rather quickly. First of all, United Kingdom first and paramount. That is absolutely clear in terms of her remit as far as I'm concerned. She also has to build in and factor in the United Kingdom's future in a globalised world, not through what I call the European Union blinkers. So forget, Mr. Juncker's 5-year plan. Forget his 10 areas of things like a digital single market, immigration control, energy union, all of these sort of aspects which are constructed around a 28 member state, totalitarian state aspect. She is in a position to actually look at what is best in terms of the future for decades to come for this United Kingdom. And I emphasise, and I do hope it will be the United Kingdom. I do hope, this is where she's going to find it much tougher. I personally want to see a clean Brexit. The European Union has adopted a phraseology of soft and hard Brexit. I have no truck with that at all. For me, it's got to be clean Brexit, because clean Brexit means no residual liabilities or responsibilities to the European Union. If we don't achieve what I call clean Brexit, well, quite frankly, European Union, bring it on, because then we can start reminding them of, for instance, the UK's interest in the European Investment Bank. Just their liability there would cancel out the fine that Mr. Juncker is thinking of levying, the 50 or 60 billion, depending what mood he's in. And then there are other aspects in terms of the monies that the United Kingdom gave up front in the 50s when Europe was being rebuilt. So, you know, if they want to get into that sort of argument, that's fine. But I think what is absolutely the most important factor is that for decades to come, general elections will become meaningful. And I'm hoping that James, the MP this evening, will actually pick up on this. Because the point I want to develop there and leave you with as my ending statement, when you vote in the general election, you have in front of you, you know who you're going to vote, you're voting for to head this country, our Prime Minister. You have the details around the manifesto commitments that that party is prepared to make, and you're comfortable with the political position that that party represents. None of that happens in terms of the European Union elections. And go back, ladies and gentlemen, to July 2014. At no point in time did any of us know we were going to vote for Mr. Juncker to be the President of the European Union. We had no idea of his 10-point strategy in terms of a manifesto, election manifesto. We had no idea of the key spokespersons that he was going to appoint. And quite frankly, we went in blinded in terms of the direction that the European Union was taking. So, the future, as far as I'm concerned, to borrow that advertising slogan, the future is very, very, very bright indeed for the United Kingdom, and I welcome the decision we took. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diane. I'm sure everyone in the room can agree you've given us a lot of food for thought, and I know lots of you will have questions, but I'm going to ask you to sit on those a little while longer. I'd like to introduce Gudea of Northwood. He was made a life peer by the Queen in 2016. He made his maiden speech on the 27th of October 2016 during a debate on championing global free trade. Baron Gudea has 25 years' extensive experience of advising on complex, often cross-border mergers and acquisitions. He has played a pioneering role in connecting emerging market companies with developed markets. Please welcome Baron Gudea.
Thank you, Gresham. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here, particularly after the last 24 hours, which has been a pretty unnerving and harrowing experience in Westminster. I mean, you could hear, and Diane, I think you've clearly been in the thick of it in Europe, and you can hear from her comments how frustrated, if not jaded, the experience has been for her. I take a more nuanced or view of all of this, coming from a business and financial background. I'm not a professional politician, and a little bit more, if I put this way, a practical approach. And what I'd like to be able to do is really just maybe explore how the dynamics of the negotiation might unfold as we trigger Article 50 next Wednesday, which is when it's scheduled. And I do that, based on 25 years experience of having, as Gresham said, negotiated some fairly large and complex corporate and financial transactions. And frankly, what this country faces, pales into insignificance in terms of the sort of heroic and daunting task ahead. So the first comment I would say is that as this Article 50 bill has been going through Parliament, we spent far much time on the process issues, and we've sort of generated more heat and light. And really, I believe that we should be giving the Prime Minister maximum negotiating flexibility, because the success or failure of this negotiation is going to make or break her premiership. And she has the clearest of political incentives in advance of the 2020 general election to deliver, which will be a de facto referendum on the outcome, or indeed, and I think one of the interesting issues, it may well end up defining the negotiating parameters of the remaining process, because I think this is going to definitely take beyond 2 years, which we'll explore, I think, in a minute. But basically, following the Prime Minister's 17th of January speech at Lancaster House and the white paper that was produced, what is clear is that we are trying to seek an unprecedented free trade agreement with deeper access to the EU single market across both goods and, importantly, services than is currently enjoyed by any third country. So that's what we're trying to do, and I think that, and it probably will go beyond that. It will become effectively an association agreement, which will also encompass some non-economic areas, defence and security and other areas of cooperation. And so I think all the hyperbole is more than justified. I mean, this is the most ambitious and complex trade treaty of all time, particularly if we're going to deal with some of the more complex issues around customs union, what happens in Northern Ireland, and what happens around services, the recognition of either equivalence or mutual recognition for services. And
I wonder if you could
Yeah.
speak nearer the microphone.
oh, sure.
Many of us can't hear the benefits of your.
Let's see if this helps a little bit. Is that better?
Slightly, yes.
I'm not sure.
Going in the right
Just have to
direction.
project a bit more.
Okay.
Get as close as you can.
Yeah. Is that better?
Yes.
Excellent. So, look, I think we should examine, what sort of cards we hold. I think Diane is very confident that we have the upper hand, and what I'd like to just take you through is the reasons why I think it's not as simple as that. And I think we do have to make an honest assessment of where we stand as we're starting these negotiations. So the government negotiating position is really built on what I call 4 pillars of logic. And the first is that the Article 50 process, which is the divorce, can be undertaken in parallel with the replacement, i.e. the free trade agreement that will replace our current arrangements. And I think it's beneficial for us, for those two to be linked together, because to the extent that we do have to make any financial settlement, clearly linking the two gives us maximum leverage. And I think we'll come, if I sort of tell you these 4 areas, and we'll come on to where I think we stand on them. So that's the first thing is, how is this negotiation, what's the sequencing of it? The second is that because we start today from identical rules and regulations in the UK to what Europe has, that effectively a free trade agreement is easier than normal. It's not going to take the 6 years that it did for the Canada, or well beyond 2 years that most free trade treaties take, because actually what matters is that you need to protect against divergence of rules, and therefore you need dispute resolution mechanisms, and that's really what you're going to be arguing about, rather than trying to get convergence. The third plank, I think, of the government's strategy is that we can do this all in 2 years, and therefore any transitional arrangements are all about implementation and not about extending the timetable. Frankly, it's not 2 years, it's probably 18 months at most, because Diane and her colleagues are going to have to approve this in the European Parliament at the end of it, so you need to give them some time to do that. And then the fourth is, and I think this is the most controversial, that we can't get a deal, that we fall back on WTO terms, and that actually, I don't know if any of you have done expert negotiating theory, but that represents the acronym called BATNA, B-A-T-N-A, which stands for the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Now, let's take the first of those pillars of logic. Michel Barnier, who Diane mentioned, has made it repeatedly clear that what the EU proposes is a sequential process. The Article 50 first, followed by the new trading arrangements. And there's a standoff on that, and I think the only way that that can be unblocked is by the European Council, which I think we now know is going to meet on the 29th of April, giving a negotiating mandate to the European Commission that basically says that they should do the two in parallel. And the actual wording of Article 50 says that you should take account of the replacement arrangements. And there's going to be, in my view, an acrimonious start, because they're going to have a group, argument about what you're going to argue about on day one. The second plank of the logic is about the fact that we start from a unique position, that we've got trading conformity, and therefore actually we can offer zero for zero tariffs. I think we are placing huge faith in Homo economicus, that effectively we're all rational decision makers and we're all going to make a rational decision here. And I think Brexit was clearly a political choice, and I think it's going to receive a political response. And I think in that sense, Diane, you probably do agree. I think the EU is determined that we pay a price for leaving the club, but I detected Diane thinking it was out of some Machiavellian thing. I think it's not so much out of vindictiveness, because I think they fear that a favourable deal for Britain would create a bad precedent and actually encourage other member states to follow. So effectively, they don't want our Brexit to be a success, because then others will say, well, great, let's copy what Britain has done. So they want us to pay a price. We want to naturally minimise the economic impact. And put it crudely, will we get away with a slap on the wrist, or will it be a slap on the face? And I don't actually think we'll know until a lot later, until all the contentious issues are on the table and we get to the 11th hour of the horse trading, because there's this EU expression that nothing's decided, nothing's agreed till everything's agreed, and that's you get the last minute horse trading. I think there's interestingly on the geopolitics, if Macron in France or Schulz in Germany and or both are installed, I think that will embolden the European hawks to play hardball with us, which could be quite an interesting dynamic, and obviously that will play out in the next 6 months. I think there is a bear trap waiting for us in the negotiation, which is that actually, because the European Union have a trade surplus, it's actually much easier with us. It's much easier on goods. It's much easier for them to give us a 0-0 deal on tariffs for goods, but actually a less favourable compromise on services, where we actually have a service and competitive advantage. I think that actually is one that I do think is important, not least because we enjoy a 72 billion surplus on services. The city and professional services contributes 66 billion of tax revenues to this country. That's more than the whole education budget, or more than the defence budget, so to put into context. In order to get, and this is, I know, is a contentious issue, but I think in order to get a preferential deal in services, we are going to get asked the question, can we get some form of preferential access to your new immigration policy? I'm not saying that they're saying free movement, but whatever our new immigration policy is, the request will be, if we're going to give you preferential access to our market, you give us preferential access to your immigration policy. And let's see how that develops. We actually have to define our immigration policy to start with, which is, I think, something that we need to clearly do as a matter of priority. Then I think the third area is on this timetable, which I think I do think it's unfortunate the government is talking itself into a corner on timing. I think all the evidence shows that we're not going to be able to do an FTA in 2 years. So we're going to end up, frankly, at the end of this, on the 29th of March 2019, having to do something which does extend the timetable for the free trade agreement, period. We may be out of the EU, technically, we finished the Article 50 process, but we're going to have to keep negotiating the FTA. We may come up with heads of terms on it or a detailed agreement on it, but that's, I think, what's going to happen. I think the reason why they are not conceding this yet is they just want to keep the maximum pressure on timing and say, look, we can do this in 2 years, and the EU has got to come back to us saying they can't do it rather than we saying you can't do it. I think that's the reason why I think they're maintaining this position. And then the fourth area is this phrase, no deal is better than a bad deal. Now, I do, I do in this context disagree with the Minister, maybe that she has to say that for negotiating purposes, but frankly I think the EU will take the view that any deal is better than no deal. And why? Because I think the cost of a abrupt exit is quite significant, because it is the Grand Canyon of all cliff edges. Because we are falling, it's interesting, I know Ivan Rogers may not be popular in certain quarters, but he did give some evidence to the EU Brexit Committee, who's been formed by the House of Commons, and you could see the pale faces on everybody's, all of these people taking the evidence when he pointed out that actually no country, not even the US, trades on pure WTO terms. In financial services, for example, the US actually has an agreement. So I think, and what I will say is obviously the government is saying, Prime Minister is saying we're not going into this expecting to fail. We're obviously expecting an agreement. So actually that hopefully will be the outcome. But I don't think there's credibility in saying that actually no deal is better than a bad deal. Look, the honest assessment, and I know people may not like to hear it, but I say it as somebody who spent 25 years in business, is that there's a negotiating asymmetry. It's basically 27 versus 1 against a 2-year ticking clock without an easily palatable fallback. And I personally think that we are going to have to either buy our way or charm our way out of this. Fortunately, our surprisingly resilient economic position means that, frankly, we have got a little bit of room for manoeuvre. And I think the recent budget showed that we've got a bit of headroom on our structural deficit, which means that if we did have to, make some payments over a period of time, then that's certainly possible. I think we are going to have to make sure that the European voices within the business community are talking to their own governments and talking some sense to them, so that we do get the sort of deal that we want. And frankly, in conclusion, what I would say is that to achieve a smooth, smart, successful Brexit, I think, and that to secure the most advantageous agreement going forward, we are going to have our checkbook ready, and we're going to have to win friends and influence people as never before. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know lots of you have things you you want to come back with on that, I'll just ask each to hold that just a little bit longer. I'd like to welcome James Cleverly here today, in particular difficult times. I know you all appreciate his presence as much as I do. James Cleverly MP has been the MP for Braintree since May 2015 and was a member of the London Assembly from 2008 to 2016. He has been awarded the Efficiency Decoration in his time in the Territorial Army for long service in the reserves of the British Army. James has called for the UK to look towards the Commonwealth for free trade agreements. Please welcome James Cleverly MP.
Can everyone hear me at the back? Yeah, unlucky. Normally people pay extra, so they don't have to listen to me. I'm gonna put my stopwatch on because this is a subject that I feel quite passionate about. I'm very interested in, and left to my own devices, I will be speaking on this topic until well into next week. So I've got my stopwatch on, so I don't overrun, and make sure we have enough time later on for questions. And I always say not to start a speech with an apology, but I have to apologise for being late. I left the house a little bit later than anticipated, which of course meant that I got caught in the rush hour traffic, and that slowed me down. And I have to make another apology for starting the speech with an apology. Now I didn't pick up on everything that was said. But I did pick up there were some areas of disagreement between my position and the position that you've just heard, and I think it's worth bearing in mind that there is a lot of genuine disagreement about how this might play out amongst people who have absolutely got this country's best intentions or best future at heart. I think it's worth bearing in mind that these differences of opinion will evolve over time, and as we move forward, the range of potential options, the range of potential futures for the country will narrow, and we will increasingly see a better idea of what the future is going to look like. Full disclosure, I campaigned and I voted for the UK to leave the EU. Resham's already said that I'm passionate about our international trading relationships. I focused most recently on our relationships with the Commonwealth. But one of the reasons why I felt that our best future, certainly long term, certainly medium term, and possibly even in the short term, outside the EU, was because the EU is a spectacularly rubbish negotiator on international trade deals. And when I say spectacularly rubbish, I mean spectacularly rubbish. The EU says quite proudly it has something like 30, 40, 50 international trade deals. Well done. And if you're the kind of person who says, never mind the quality, feel the width, then that might be your thing. But when you look down the list of nations, there are, and I don't want to be rude to these very nations, some real minnows in economic terms on that list. Basically, the EU has negotiated 2 free trade agreements that are actually worth anything, of any great substantial amount. One is with South Korea, the other one with Switzerland, and that's it. That's it. South Korea is a very forward-thinking international trading partner, and Switzerland have already expressed a significant desire to work with the UK post-Brexit. I was recently in Geneva, and we spoke with the World Trade Organization. That was the main reason for the visit. But we also spoke with EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, of which Switzerland is a member, and they were very keen to get the UK back in the team. Not only that, I co-wrote, and when I say co-wrote, my co-author, Tim Hewish of the Royal Commonwealth Association, did all the writing, Because he's a very clever guy and because he's very, very knowledgeable, my contribution to the paper was mainly editing out big swathes of the report. But between the two of us, he thrashed out a report on Commonwealth free trade options post-Brexit. Now, I'm a backbencher and Tim is a policy wonk in the Commonwealth. Neither of us have got big pulling power in the media, so we felt we needed an international heavy hitter to try and get us a little bit of exposure. And we approached, rather tentatively, Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia. And his response was so enthusiastic, even I was shocked and amazed. And he wrote a foreword to our paper, which was, again, so enthusiastic, so positive, that I actually had to edit it back a little bit so that people would genuinely believe it was written by Tony Abbott rather than me. I've spoken with Tony on a number of occasions since then, and he reminded me, and I will remind all of us in the room, that Australia was hurt as a nation when the UK joined the EU, because we very unceremoniously dumped them as an international party. The New Zealanders were hurt even more than the Australians. Now, I'm a rugby player, as you may have guessed by my build, and the international competition between the Australians and the New Zealanders on almost everything is quite famous. And the competition between Australia and New Zealand to be the first country in the world to sign a free trade agreement with the UK is amazing. They are, I was about to say literally, but I don't mean literally, of course I mean metaphorically, crawling over each other to get that free trade agreement. And whilst numerically a free trade agreement with Australia would not come even close to the kind of volumes of trade that we do with the EU, it will lay down a very clear marker to the countries that we are negotiating with, that we, and I know you said there was an asymmetry in the negotiations, and you are completely right. You are completely right. There is a massive asymmetry in the negotiations. That is, we can do them, and they're rubbish at them. And I've been a negotiator my entire career, and there are certain things which the Prime Minister has made clear, which has been, I think, a very important thing. Firstly, if you're not willing, under certain circumstances, to walk away from the negotiating table, it's not a negotiation. It's called begging. And that's not what we're about. Point two, the negotiator that has the biggest time pressure is the one that gets the worst deal. And the whole no deal is better than the bad deal is about managing the timescale. What the Prime Minister has said is that we as a nation want, indeed I think there is a degree of inevitability about a future trade deal between ourselves and the EU 27 nations. And ideally we would like to do it in the 2-year window set out by the Article 50 process. But if we cannot get the right deal for Britain within that 2-year window, then we'll just wait a bit longer. And if that means that for a short period of time we have to revert to WTO trade tariffs, then we will look to do that. But also in the paper that I wrote, I said that we should seek to become a member of TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement, which would go a long way to reducing those behind the border barriers that you see in trade in services, which we've already heard is a very, very important part of the UK's export mix. The EU will, without a shadow of a doubt, want to play hardball, and I would think less of them if they didn't. But we are not a passive player in this negotiation. It was already mentioned that a lot of European companies will want to put economic pressure on their politicians who might come at these negotiations from a more political point of view. Because the reason that Volkswagen Audi raise capital in the UK is not because we are members of the EU. It's because the City of London is a really good place to raise capital. And the reason that international legal disputes are often thrashed out in law firms in London, again, is not because they're doing us some kind of favour as a fellow EU member. It's because the international respect for the British legal system and the British legal sector is globally positive. People do business with Britain because it makes economic sense. And companies like, companies like, as I say, Volkswagen, Audi, and BMW, and all those German manufacturing firms will be putting political pressure. But I tell you what else will be putting, I tell you who else will be putting political pressure, is other nations internationally. The Japanese ambassador, the Japanese have been admirably forthright in their views about Brexit and their concerns about Brexit. British ambassador in a public, well, it was in a private lunch, but these were not Chatham House rules. These were comments that he was quite happy to have discussed more widely. Basically said, Japan's been trying to strike a deal with the EU for years, and the EU have been rubbish at striking that deal. And he said, they mean well, but they can't do deals. And he said, but if you need Japan to lend you horsepower, to lend you negotiating weight, in order for the UK to strike a deal with the EU, then Japan is willing to lend us that horsepower. Because Japan is heavily invested in the UK. Nissan being one of the most high profile, but there are a number of other companies where Japan is heavily invested. They have a vested interest in the UK being economically successful. And they are quite happy to help us bang heads together over in the EU27 to protect their investment in the UK economy. It is not going to be easy. It is not going to be quick. But nothing of any value was ever obtained quickly and easily. So we are going to have a couple of years, and it probably won't be 2 years, it will be probably longer than that, of very hard negotiating. And there are some habits the EU would do well to get out of. We've already heard the nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. Well, talking again to Australian negotiators, they say, agree what you can agree, write it down, sign it, get that off the table, and then move on to the second iteration. The EU don't like doing that. We're going to have to help them get good at negotiating. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much. I hope I haven't bored you too much into submission, and we'll take questions at the end. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
I'm sure you'll all agree that was incredibly informative and entertaining. Thank you very much, James. And now last, but by no means least, probably the only lawyer I've ever met who could explain EU law to me and get me to understand it, Martin Howe QC specialises in EU law and intellectual property. He is chairman of Lawyers for Britain, which campaigned for a leave vote, supported the government's appeal in the Article 50 case, and continues to work on the nuts and bolts of a clean exit from the EU. He advised on the Conservative manifesto policy of replacing the Human Rights Act with a new act based on a UK Bill of Rights. Please welcome Martin Howe QC.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for inviting me tonight. I'd like to be positive. I'd like to look forward to the future. And our future is a future now. Decision has been taken. It is a future outside the European Union, and I'd like to look at, from a legal point of view, mainly, at the opportunities that will give us. I think it is time that we stopped obsessing about the European Union all the time. I played my part in the referendum campaign, and a lot of what I said was about how awful the European Union is and how dreadful it is to be in it. And I agree with Diane on what she said, but actually let's move on from that. We decided to leave. It doesn't matter how awful it is, because we're not going to be in it. Let's move on to the future. A future is a future as an independent nation. And what is most important to us, and this is very important indeed, what is most important to us is our relations, including our trade relations, with the rest of the world. There has been a consistent change in our pattern of trade over the past 20 years, in which our trade in both goods and services with the European Union has diminished relative to our trade with the rest of the world. To the extent that last available statistics, over 55% of our exports are outside the European Union, and what's more, the trend continues. So let's think, from the point of view of where we are now, what we need to do to safeguard our future. And okay, a deal of some kind with the European Union is an important issue. I agree with that. But it's not the all-consuming obsession which so many people seem to think. We may get a good deal with them, we may not get a good deal with them, and I'm really glad that the Prime Minister's answer to that is if it isn't a good deal, we won't do it. I do not agree with suggestions that no deal with the European Union is a cliff edge. I think that this is simply Project Fear reincarnated, was run all the way through the campaign. It's simply not the case. And let me explain why. The European Union is not actually a free trade bloc. That's not what it's about. Its structures do allow free trade internally. But what they also do, what the legal structures of the European Union do, is they restrict your ability as a member state to trade with countries outside the European Union. And it does it in a number of ways. Most importantly, the common customs tariff means that every member state has to impose the same tariffs on imports from the rest of the world. And those tariffs have been constructed deliberately so that they favour certain protected sectors inside the European Union, notably French farmers. We have incredibly high tariffs on food, which is imported into the European Union. For us, as a net food importing nation, it's sheer madness to have these tariffs. For other sectors heavily protected are clothing and textiles. And here, in this country, we have very little industry left there. Such industry as we do, it's high quality, high value industry, not sensitive to tariffs and so on. And yet, our people, our consumers, have to pay substantially above world prices for textiles, shoes, and so on, in order to benefit people on the continent. And the most important thing that we get by leaving the European Union is we get the freedom to conduct our own international trade. And we can do that under WTO terms. We are a member of the WTO, although at the moment, while we are within the European Union, certain important aspects are controlled by the European Union, notably our tariffs. And while it controls our tariffs, that prevents us from doing free trade agreements with anyone outside the European Union. However, let's look forward to 2 years from the 29th of March onwards up to the 29th of March 2019. And that is a period during which our most important priority should actually be to look outside the European Union and to look to what we can do with other countries outside. Now, don't be taken in by suggestions made by Mr. Barnier and Mr. Juncker, naturally. Oh, you're not allowed to negotiate trade deals while you're inside the European Union. Not true. What we're not allowed to do is to impinge on the European Union's exclusive competence. They have exclusive competence to control our external trade up to the 29th of March 2019, but not a day afterwards. We are perfectly entitled to enter into negotiations, to negotiate and to sign treaties which come into force the day after we leave in exactly the same way as if you're employed by an employer. You're entitled to negotiate a new employment contract sign it, which comes into force the day after your notice with your current employer expires. There's no incompatibility with our legal obligations. And the other thing, there's a big misconception about trading under WTO rules. There seemed that, and this misconception was contained, in fact, in Mr. Osborne's Treasury forecasts, which Mr. Osborne induced the Treasury to produce to the detriment of the honour and reputation of the impartiality of the civil service, which I think will take a very long time for it to live down. And that was a suggestion that once we leave the European Union, we have to maintain the same tariffs as we, at the moment, have under European Union rules. This is absolute nonsense. What the rules say is if we leave the European Union, and we don't have an agreement with them, let's assume that, then each party has to have uniform standard tariffs. In other words, the European Union would then impose its tariffs, its standard tariffs, not allowed to have special tariffs higher for some countries than others. That's the basic rule of the WTO. So the European Union would have its tariffs imposed on us. Now, the study done by Civitas shows that that were to happen, our exporters would have to pay tariffs on imports into the European Union, but the amount of those would be total amount of those would be significantly less than the current contribution we're making to the net European Union budget. So we'd be quids in, even on that basis. And however, the big fallacy why the Treasury forecasts ended up prophesying doom and gloom was an assumption that we as a country would impose the same level of tariffs as the European Union imposes on imports to us. And this is sheer madness. We're a pro-free trading nation, we're a net importer of food. Why on earth would we isolate our consumers from world markets, drive up prices, and prevent us from economically self-harm ourselves in this way? The WTO rules simply impose ceilings on the tariffs. We're perfectly entitled to charge lower tariffs, or indeed zero tariffs, which, for example, the economists for free trade, Patrick Minford and company, advocate as a step to take on the day after we leave the European Union. We don't have to go quite that far, zero tariffs on everything, to say that getting rid of tariffs or reducing them unilaterally over wide sectors is economically beneficial. Now, let me come back to the legalities of Article 50. There's a conception around this is stacked against the member state leaving. No, it isn't. It is very well structured as a mechanism for leaving, because it gives the withdrawing member state an absolute and unassailable right to leave. At the end of the 2 years, that it cannot be prevented from leaving by obfuscation, delay, negotiations. If no deal is reached at the end of that period, we leave. We're free. We're no longer controlled in our laws, we're no longer controlled in our external trade policy, and that is an enormous advantage for the withdrawing country, so long as we're ready. Well, the Second World War was a huge undertaking, and we entered into that in a lot less time than the 2 years that we'll have to do taxing tasks like setting up customs controls and procedures. These are the necessary tasks which need to be done to get ourselves ready. But all we need to do is bear in mind that most of our trade, the majority of our trade, is on WTO terms with the rest of the world, and we need to just make sure that the administrative arrangements in relation to our trade with the European Union are set up properly so that they will function on the day after we leave, on the 29th of March 2019, without the need for an agreement with the European Union. So that is our baseline. If we're in a position of saying, oh, it's terrible, oh gosh, we must have an agreement, well, we might as well just sort of bend down and take whatever sops they offer us. It's completely hopeless, and it's completely unjustified by the facts. So we need to be ready to leave with no deal, and if we're ready to leave with no deal, then I think there's a very good chance we'll be capable of getting a good deal, because the economics certainly stack up in favour, not of giving us a good deal, we're not supplicants, but in the mutual advantages of a free trade deal between us and the European Union, which benefits them actually more than it benefits us, simply because the numbers and the pattern of imports and exports involved. So I think there's a very good chance of getting a good deal, but I wouldn't be crying into my milk if we don't. I agree that there are political obstacles potentially in the face of getting a good deal. It makes quite clear that the institutions, and the Commission in particular, are more concerned with some sort of demonstration exercise than they are with getting a good deal for the people of Europe and the people of member states. One aspect is this absolutely absurd, completely ridiculous financial claim, which hasn't been formally presented yet, but has been presented through the media in a sort of campaign of arguments at the level of, well, if you come to a party, then if it's your turn to buy the rounds, you can't walk away without not buying the rounds. I know, very insightful legal analysis by Mr. Juncker's official media spokesman. Anyway, if you want detail on that, there's a 20-page paper on our Lawyers for Britain website explaining why they have absolutely no case at all. We don't legally owe a penny. There's an argument for paying small amounts just for a quiet life, but I really don't think they justify anything more than that. So I look forward to, with equanimity, to the conclusion of these negotiations. I think they will either be concluded at the very last minute in March 2019, or maybe not at all. If they're not at all, then it might actually be easier to do a free trade deal afterwards, because all this political rubbish that Mr. Juncker will be cleared away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Don't know about the rest of you, but I'm quite pleased to hear there's no legal claim over my future money or earnings. We have now reached the end of our speaker section, and it's the moment you've probably all been waiting for, the Q&A section. I would just like to remind you that all of our panellists have agreed to give up their time to be here. You may disagree with some of their opinions or all of their opinions, but please keep your questions respectful and polite, otherwise I will stop you. Please do keep them short as well, nice and concise, so that we don't have to remember too much. Well, they don't have to remember too much. If you could just stand up, we don't have a second mic, so if you could just stand up, practice projection, and just give us your question. We'll be sitting at the panel, I'll just point out, so if you would all just join me in applauding all our speakers, and we will start Okay, if anyone has any questions, just stick your hand up. I do have some from people who couldn't make it, but I'd like to give you all yours if we... Yes, gentleman over there? Oh, and sorry, if you have a specific person on the panel you'd like to give it to, please say their names, otherwise we'll give everyone a chance to answer your question.
Just got a brief question to the last speaker. It's about tariffs, and it's possibly I didn't quite hear or understand what you said. You said that if we left without an agreement and we exported to the common EU, then they would put tariffs on what we exported. And then you seem to say that they didn't have to be the same, but presumably, if they did that, we would then put the same tariffs on stuff we imported from the EU. So if they put tariffs on us exporting, then we would put tariffs on BMWs coming into this country and French wine. Is that right or not?
I think he's talking about most favoured nation.
This is a bit technical, and maybe I didn't make it clear. The rule is, it's called, quite right, it's called most favoured nation, and that is, if you operate tariffs, you have to have the same tariffs on everybody. As a country or as a customs union, you're not allowed to have different tariffs on imports from different countries. Okay, you're not allowed to say, we're charging higher tariffs on you than on you. The European Union, if we leave with no deal, would therefore actually be required under the WTO rules to have impose its standard tariffs on imports from the United Kingdom. The point I'm making is we would, in fact, have to impose our standard tariffs on imports from them, but we have complete freedom in setting the levels of those tariffs. Now, I'm a lawyer, not an economist, but there's no economic rationale for tit-for-tat tariffs, because the people who pay the tariffs on imports are your consumers. There's a sort of, there's a negotiating argument for doing it, but there isn't necessarily a strong economic argument for doing it. You'd be better off not having tariffs and not titting for tatting.
Thank you.
Yeah, the UK economy, I wouldn't get too freaked out about tariffs. I mean, they're kicked around an awful lot, but as already been said, the UK is a service-based economy, and the tariff regimes don't apply to services. With services, things like regulatory convergence, mutual recognition of qualifications, that kind of stuff, are far more important than tariffs. And it's also worth bearing in mind in terms of our ability to export and our international competitiveness. The pound's had an 18% devaluation, which has wiped out any punitive effect that imposed tariffs would have on UK products. So UK products are now 18% cheaper on a like-for-like basis, 18% cheaper to overseas buyers. WTO tariffs basically apply a ceiling, and even the most aggressive WTO tariffs are around the 15% mark. So we've already wiped out those tariff regimes. And as I say, the UK economy, because we're not a product-heavy economy, tariffs aren't great, but they're not as bad as a lot of the conversations around will have you believe.
Well, probably not much other than to agree with James that actually, in a way, that the whole tariff discussion is sort of a red herring, because actually it's the non-tariff barriers, particularly for services, which are more important. And I think the WTO is very restricted in what it actually says on services, which is why actually you do have effectively a legal vacuum if you do leave without a deal, because you don't know what the basis is of selling your services.
Thank you. Yeah, Peter?
Thank you, Dolly. I just wanted to ask a question about skilled workers and foreign skilled workers. The words HS2 and Heathrow send shivers down the spine of people in this area, but if either of them are to get built, and obviously around here we hope not, or if we are to build all these homes that we need, we are going to need a skilled workforce that builds them. The simple fact of the matter is, as somebody who works in the construction industry, if we were to send all of our skilled workers home and now getting built, because we rely on highly skilled people who are paying quite high taxes, because we've got Polish and Romanian brick workers on £1,000 a week, so they're submitting and paying their dues. How quickly do we think the government needs to get an answer on things like skilled workers, people that are living here, paying in, part of our community, not the people who are scrounging, they're valued people, and how quickly do you think the government needs to get answers on that? Because if we're 2 years away, people are going home already and they want answers.
The answer to your question is, I think one of the key discussions that we're going to have over the next couple of years. I was very disappointed with some of the things that the Prime Minister took to the negotiating table. This emergency break on migrant benefits, I think, was a complete red herring. And I was quite angry about that because it reinforced the remarkably inaccurate perception that the majority of EU migrants came to the UK to claim benefits. The vast majority of EU migrants come to the UK to work and pay taxes. Now, there is an issue with regards to downward pressure on salaries. That's one of the things we do need to be aware of. But one of the things I really hope through the Brexit process is that we get into the habit of having a much more mature conversation about migration. And we've been allowed to be politically lazy for 40 years by basically saying, oh, we would make migration really perfect and easy and palatable and beautiful. It's the nasty EU that won't let us. Well, when we leave the nasty EU, then it will be entirely down to us about our national migration policy. And for the first time in 40 years, we will have to have a migration policy because we've just bucked that difficult question for 40 years. Now, if any of you were hoping there'd be a sudden move to zero immigration, I've got news for you. That's not going to happen. And if any of you think it's going to be below 100,000 anytime in my lifetime, that ain't going to happen either. And we're going to have to be much more honest with the British people about why we have migrants, in which sectors, their value to the British economy, and our attitude towards migration more generally. And as far as I'm concerned, not a moment too soon.
Can I just give an EU perspective on this? I'm sure you'll appreciate that because being an MEP, I spend a considerable amount of time in Brussels and Strasbourg. And as a result, late night TV, I typically watch France 24 or Arte, which is a joint French-Belgian programme. And it's very interesting to watch how they're portraying the whole Brexit situation. And the point I'm making with that is that you hear and see none in terms of the media furore around skilled workers in Europe. This is very much something that the UK media has picked up on and focused on, and is actually delivering the Project Fear and Project Revenge on behalf of the likes of Juncker very, very ably. My second point would be, if you look around the world, countries like Australia, there is an extremely good dialogue and setup between industry sectors and government. And it goes back to James's point. We have become lazy government here. We don't have that relationship. We don't have that communication conduit that says, on a planned basis, what do we need here? And if we go back on some of the decisions that the UK government has made, and I think have been very bad decisions, particularly under the Labour government, for instance, cutting back on the nurse training programme. Investing in doctor training programs, but then not allowing for them, once they've actually qualified as medics, to actually then go on to jobs here in the United Kingdom, effectively exporting that sort of skill base. So I think there's a whole series of issues that can be addressed during the Brexit negotiation system. But can I just finalise by saying, if we look at this aspect of a visa-based entry based on your contribution work-wise and such, but we don't necessarily grant at the same time immediate residency. There's two very clear issues there. I go back to James's point. Yes, I personally would like to see a reduction in the migration numbers, but I take his point that, that we probably won't see it down to the tens of thousands that people would like. But by the same token, we do not need to continue a process that says, because you come here, and you've got a job, according to the EU rules, you then also gain immediate residency. We can move to a much, much more what I call proficient and futuristic model of migration that says, come here, give what you've got, but don't expect ultimately to stay here unless you fulfil other criteria that this country wants.
Yes?
To James, first of all, thank you for coming. It's been an extraordinarily difficult day for you in the Commons after all the personal things that's happened, and it's very. I think we've all been enthused by your passion here for the Brexit process. My question is really related to what you said about short-term, medium-term, and long-term. What do you define as being that short-term to medium-term break? And where do you see the pain coming in the short term, if there is going to be any pain?
Right, okay. I don't know if there are strict economic definitions of medium-term, long-term, short-term. In my mind, I tend to think of short-term as kind of a parliamentary cycle. So realistically, I think of short-term between 2019 to 2025, because it just so happens that this Brexit process is going to kind of sit within these kind of parliamentary terms. So I think we will see a huge amount of turbulence and friction out about 2025. But exactly how that may manifest itself, it will be over some of the things that have been well discussed. There will be some, probably some stifling of inward investment into the UK. I think that is inevitable. I don't think it will be absolute, and I don't think it will be catastrophic, but there will be delays in inward investment. I think if in that period of time, or certainly, straddling the 2020 general election, we can nail down a couple of free trade deals with decent-sized economies. Singapore very keen to do a deal. South Korea have shown themselves in the military what we call forward-leaning, so very keen to do a deal. We've got CETA, so we've got a template deal for Canada. We could probably adapt CETA, get that squared away. Australia and New Zealand we've already discussed, and if President Trump is as good as his word, and that's a bold call, we may well be able to, by 2025, have a free trade agreement with the United States of America. If we get those things nailed down, I suspect that the EU will see that actually the sabre rattling, which is inevitable in the short term, won't have had the desired effect politically, and that they will actually have a big dose of pragmatism, which means that from that point onwards, we will have a much healthier economic relationship. The big caveat to all this is at some point in that period, we're going to have a cyclical downturn. As sure as eggs are eggs. The problem we have now is that will be blamed on Brexit, in the way that all the economic good news is not attributed to Brexit, the whole despite Brexit. When that cyclical downturn happens, as sure as eggs are eggs it will be blamed on Brexit. People like me politically will have to deal with that. But I think as long as we keep cool heads and focus on what the real aim is, which is not to punish the EU or to be proven right, but to actually get an economy that works for British people, I think it's doable. Thank you for your kind words as well. Sorry, thank you.
I know that question was directed at James, but I think it's a really interesting one about pain points. I'm going to ask everyone on the panel to address it with particular thoughts to whichever of you wants to handle this. Things like passporting, legal claims to financial funds, which I know Martin kind of discussed briefly, but any other kind of legal, financial, immigration, all those kinds of things, especially passporting in the city and what it might mean for London, that would be great.
So look, I probably will get labelled, I agree with James, but I think I do agree with a lot of what he said. The only thing I would do is put some facts and numbers behind it, because I think my theme here is to be, I'm from business, I'm from finance, I believe in looking at the evidence rather than the emotion or the ideology. So I actually think that this is not a matter of either or. We do need European trade, and it accounts for 44% of our exports. The Commonwealth, and I have a triple Commonwealth identity. I'm British citizen of Indian origin, born in Uganda, so I couldn't have more connections with the Commonwealth, and I passionately believe in increasing our trade with them. But they account for 8% of our exports. So we've got to be, I think, I don't like this, false choice, false binary. It's not either or, we've got to do both. And it's going to take some time to build up. You can do the maths yourself. If you've got, in order to compensate for a 10% reduction in our European trade, we've got to effectively grow our Commonwealth trade by 50%, which is basic math. So look, the other thing is that, and I've done a lot with the government in our relationship with UK and India. I sit on the UK-India CEO Forum, which was established by the Prime Ministers of India and the UK, and I accompanied Theresa May on her first trade mission, which was to India last November. And we talked about a free trade agreement with them. They are by far and away the largest of the 52 Commonwealth countries, so they should be on the top of our list. It's going to be a tough negotiation because they're also a service economy, and they want access for their IT workers and for their people to our economy. They haven't actually got that many goods to sell us, sadly. So those things are going to be tricky, and I'm very pleased that James said what he said on immigration, because I think we do need. Because I'm afraid that people in the Brexit referendum, some people did feel that voting leave would enable us to get immigration down to below tens of thousands. Some didn't, but there were different reasons why people did it. But I'm afraid some did, and I think they are going to be disappointed because actually even the free trade deals that we need to do will need to have that wiggle room and flexibility.
I'm just going to take a slightly different slant, but just ask you to consider some of the following points. Mr Juncker has already now announced that he will not be standing for a second term. He's going to have a bad enough epitaph that he saw a member state leave. So he's going to want to try and guarantee some positives for his legacy. And what I'm doing in terms of highlighting that point is there is going to be a rush through in terms of the European systems to power grab in certain key areas. And we're starting to see this already in terms of what's coming before the Parliament agenda. The last 2.5 years, now bear in mind I've only been an MEP for one mandate, but what the sort of points and comments that were made was this is the European Union in slow motion. But all of a sudden, literally within the last few months, the speed at which items are coming forward for decisions, for voting on within the Parliament, the Commission, the trilogue, etc., have already taken a position on, have really started to speed up. So I think this is something that I really want to just give you to consider in terms of the sort of danger, the elephant traps that are coming down the line. And probably one of the biggest ones, and it might interest James in this, is what the EU has planned in terms of taking a power grab on defence research and development. Now, the United Kingdom happens to be a lead in that particular area globally, and it's very interesting that the European Union has got its eyes on that jewel in the crown, if you like, and that's a sector that they're really, really focused on. So all of the time that, the attention, particularly within the media, is on the Brexit, we shouldn't forget that until the ink is dry on that document that says we finally left, that every single bit of legislation that comes before us, in terms of the Parliament, everything that is taken as a decision in trilogue, in secret, and still comes forward as legislation, UK's got to abide by, and that there are some very, very serious downsides and deficits that the European Union has planned.
Well, I think if Rachel bumps in the road, I'd like to just focus on from a legal aspect rather than other speakers have commented on the economic aspect. And it is right that legally we will remain a member of the European Union until 29th of March 2019. We will then leave unless someone is mad enough to agree some form of extension. One of the things about the Miller case, which I think is quite excellent, actually, a side effect of it. That Miller case in the Supreme Court established that the government could not, without the authority of an Act of Parliament, exercise the Article 50 right to withdraw from the European Union. And of course that was very much pressed for by those of a Remainist tendency of mind. Now, that having been established in the Supreme Court's judgment, and Parliament having now authorised withdrawal under Article 50, the consequence of that judgment is that it is not possible for the government to agree to an extension of the period of time in which we belong to the European Union without another Act of Parliament authorising that. To comment on whether such an act might, reception it might get, but it's not just a matter of the government under negotiating pressure doing some sort of deal to extend time. They would need to get parliamentary authority in order to do that, because that would extend the legal powers of the European Union over the UK for a longer period than is authorised by the current Act. But that is, so the bump in the road is actually the danger that so long as we are a member, we're still subject to the imposition of rules and regulations by qualified majority voting, which can be imposed on us. Their effect, it is true, only then lasts for a comparatively short period until we leave. We're then free to get rid of them if we don't like them. And I don't myself think we should do anything inflammatory towards the European Union on this front. But if it were the case that they started to maliciously impose rules and regulations on us and outvote us on imposing them, I think that at that point there would be a strong case for seeking parliamentary authority simply to disapply them under our domestic law, regardless of what that might do to that's the way of standing up to the European Union.
Okay. Thank you. I can see lots of hands, so I'll take two at a time now. So the two gentlemen over there, if you just, yeah. And if you could give us your question, and then if you give us your question, and then we'll give our panelists the extra challenge of answering two in one go.
If it is short, there was reference earlier on to Homo economicus and how we hope he's going to triumph. I've never been at all confident that he will, and that's one of the reasons I want out, because I don't want to be in an organisation whose leaders might slit their own members' economic throats. If reason is going to triumph, it requires the heads of governments who do depend on democratic backing in their own countries to impose the will on the theocrats like Verhofstadt and Barnier, for whom Europe, as they call it, is a religion. What do you think, and this is to all panel members, what do you think are the chances of their doing that?
Okay, question behind?
Thanks, Rachel. There's probably several people in this room with business interests in Scotland at the moment, and my question is that if Scotland do break away from the UK, and assuming that they do join Europe as an independent state, the fact that we are their main trading partner, what will that trade look like between us and them? I mean, will that operate under WTO rules? If it does, then surely that's they're shooting themselves in the foot there.
Right, two great questions. We will start with Diane, who might have more of an inside view on the chances of Scotland actually getting that membership. But if I could ask all of you to address both questions in your answer, that would be great.
Well, we had Scotland come to the Constitution Committee just before Christmas to present their case. Very, very interesting. I agree entirely with the Prime Minister. They're absolutely obsessive about this. And in terms of their goal of breaking up the United Kingdom and using the Brexit referendum outcome as the, if you like, the genie to conjure that up, I think is just a very, very bad reflection on politics in Scotland. But I think what was interesting in terms of the findings and the, if you like, the response from the Constitution Committee was best encapsulated by the Spanish MEPs, who effectively said, Scotland, go away, think again, because if you get away with it, so would Catalonia, and we're not going to allow Catalonia, so Scotland get lost. And it was very, very simple. Slightly more polite language than that, can I say?
So you've heard the bit on Scotland, so let me address whether the European political leaders will effectively rein in the European Commission. I think that's got to be our hope. I think that is the basis, frankly, on which both the Prime Minister and I was, recently speaking to David Davis on this topic as well. I think that is also, frankly, his hope too, that when the Prime Minister issues the letter next Wednesday formally, and we get the formal response, and I don't know exactly what form we'll get it in, but I assume it'll be concurrent or shortly after the 29th of April, so within 1 month, the tone and content of that response, which is by definition defined by the European Council, by the political leaders, will be something that will set the tone for the whole negotiation. And I'm hoping, and I think this is why I think our language is quite important. We may, sometimes I sort of feel that there are a lot of people who are quite ideological on all of this, who hate the guts of the people they're against the table on, but that's fine, we've got to deal with them. And there's no point winding them up, we've just got to deal with them and get on with life. And so I believe in being very pragmatic about it, so that's why we've got to deploy some charm, get them into actually getting them to negotiate with us sensibly, and that's what I think the Prime Minister will hopefully try and do, so that that response will be equally constructive on the other side.
The first question, which is basically about which gets to win, economics or politics. Well, the truth is, economics always wins, because when you try and battle between political motivations and economic necessities, ultimately what happens is the political motivations morph so that they align with the economic realities. And the EU is starting to see this, and I think their political priorities will evolve, because what they're seeing is the current structure is not working. There is massive pushback in EU nations. We're having this conversation about the French elections and Macron. You've got to remember, it's entirely feasible that neither of the main big, in brackets, political parties are going to get into the final round. It's entirely feasible that Macron, with his new party out of nowhere, and the Front National are going to get into the final two. That is a massive rejection of political status quo in France. Frau Merkel, who has been a really steady political leader in Germany, is worried about the political consequences in Germany in October of this year in her elections. And I really hope that the EU 27 will understand that if they sacrifice sensible economics on the altar of petty politics, they will be punished by their own electorates, and I think that will help them. That will help them focus the minds. You mentioned about Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon has painted herself into a really difficult corner. She did loads of sabre rattling. The SNP in general did loads of sabre rattling through the Brexit process, and they keep laying down demands because they have to feed their nationalistic beast and that nationalistic narrative. But their demands are completely unrealistic, and so they've been rejected over and over again. And each time one of their demands is rejected, they're having to double down on the bet. And once it was obvious that the UK Parliament was going to vote through the Article 50 notification bill, Nicola Sturgeon had to play the final card in her hand, which is to call for the referendum. And When you're playing the last card in your hand, you better pray it's an ace. And it wasn't, it was a deuce. And she's now basically said, I want a referendum, despite the fact that the opinion polls say she's not going to win it. Massive questions. If you want some fun, Google SNP politician, and you'll get any number of them pop up. What currency will you use? Put that into Google and listen to umpteen audio clips of SNP politicians squirming massively when asked what people will use to buy milk in Scotland if they choose to leave the UK. Because it ain't going to be the pound, and there's absolutely no guarantee, as Diane said, there is no guarantee that they're going to be allowed to join the EU. And even if they do, and I don't think they will, even if they do, it won't be straight away. And even if they do, they will have to, under the EU's own rules, sort their deficit out. And if they think that the evil government of Westminster are putting the squeeze on them economically, you wait till they try and apply the rules that the EU will enforce upon them, it will break them as an economy. So I think the SNP are going to be politically badly damaged. And Theresa May, and I'll finish on this point, Theresa May, I think, has played a blinder on this. Because she said, you want a referendum? Fine. I've got this Brexit thing I need to sort out first. Once that's done, you can have your referendum. But by the way, seeing as that will be right up against the Scottish parliamentary elections, why don't you get those out of the way first, and then you can have your referendum? Because I think the SNP will be punished at the ballot box for those elections, because their argument is just so fractured. It is all over the place.
Can I address the rather technical question that was asked, which is what would happen if Scotland were to become independent and then join the European Union as regards relations between the UK, remaining UK, and Scotland? And actually, there are two different scenarios that we have to think about. Scenario number one is we succeed as the UK in reaching a comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union. In that scenario, then if Scotland were to become independent and then join the EU, that agreement would then encompass Scotland, so free trade would continue across the border. But if you think about it, on the other hand, since the main argument the SNP put for the EU independence vote is it's so terrible being forced out of the EU, if it's a scenario where we've done a deal and we're back in trade relations, preferential trade relations with the European single market, then much of that argument for independence disappears. The other scenario is if we don't succeed in doing a deal. Now, in that scenario, then Scotland, if Scotland were to become independent, and then let's assume it succeeds in joining the EU, gets over problems like being required prima facie to adopt the euro as its currency, and the other problems, and the Spanish not liking the idea, what happens? The answer then is exactly the same rules would apply, and the European Union would have to impose its standard tariff on goods imported from England into Scotland, and we likewise would need to impose whatever our standard tariff was. So we're going to end up having low border posts along the Scottish border, which is another problem. And it's a much bigger problem for Scotland than for the remaining UK, because a very, very high percentage of Scottish trade is with the rest of the European Union as compared with its trade with other EU countries.
Okay, we've only got about 10 minutes left, so I'm just going to ask our panellists to speak, just keep things a bit more concise. I don't know, everyone's loving it, but I want everyone to get their questions. So we'll take the gentleman and, the two at the back there, yeah.
As someone who is a Remainer who's now coming to terms with leaving the EU, we're a Democrat, so we live with it. But I also work and have worked for quite a while with the higher education sector. And as an economy, we're based around innovation. And for me, one of the great successes of the EU was the fact that it got all our universities and such like working together with other European universities, something which is much harder to do with the US because of the barriers that they put up. I'm really interested to hear your views as to how we can ensure that we as such an innovative nation can stay at the lead, at the forefront of that position that we've now assumed in Europe.
Great. Yeah, I want to ask you a question. Thank you, panel, for your very informative and lively debate. First, I'd just like to make a comment. And I feel like the line that we're getting from a lot of politicians at the moment is Great Britain first, and it's at the expense of our neighbours that we'll get Great Britain first. And I personally find that I feel like over the past few months, Britain's becoming increasingly smug in its selfishness. And I just that's the feeling that I'm getting. I find it a bit unpleasant. And then you're just to talk more about people. So Diane, you talked about, I understand what you're saying about you have to keep our negotiations, when you're going into negotiations, you can't reveal what you're going into, and you have to keep things secret. But I'm a doctor, and I work with many of my nursing colleagues, and many of my doctor colleagues are from Europe, and this complete silence of whether or not they'll have the right to remain here in 2 years' time creates such anxiety and real just sadness among many of my colleagues in the environment we work in. And you do really feel it in hospitals at the moment, that feeling of just real sadness. And I would just like the panel to just touch on that. And then the last question I have is just a quick question about what we're going to do about the European Medicines Agency, and following on from my next to me, what are we going to do? How will we limit the impact Brexit's going to have on R&D? Great, lots there to address. Diane, I'll let you start. That's all right.
Okay. Well, as somebody who has played a big role in terms of higher education innovation, worked with, for instance, the Set Squared Partnership, which takes some of the key universities in the southeast and helps them find their innovation. It's very interesting that they may have campaigned in terms of the academic staff to actually remain, but talking to them now, their issue is very much, no, we're happy with the consequences of leaving and we don't see any threats there. In terms of the NHS healthcare staff, I really fail to understand what the problem is. When you're a Romanian doctor or a Polish doctor, and your ability to earn the sort of salary that you can do over here, what is the draw for you to actually go back? And there's been no threat whatsoever to expel any individual representing any staff, any skill base or whatever from the United Kingdom. On the contrary, it's been the European negotiators that have come up with that. In terms of the EMA currently 600 people, staff in London. Quite frankly, it doesn't really matter where it goes. The big markets, in terms of registering patents for new treatments, new medical devices and such, that's where the industry will actually go in terms of the registration. If, however, the patent registration transfers, so let's say Ireland is successful in getting it, when it comes down to it, where do companies want to sell their products? It's going to be the United Kingdom, it's going to be North America. It doesn't actually matter where the EMA is positioned.
Sorry, can I address, the European Medicines Agency, just a technical problem, a technical issue or legal issue. It has nothing to do with patents. Patents are a completely different system from the European Medicines Agency. The patent system, in fact, that we're in is under the European Patent Convention. The European Patent Convention is not a European Union convention. It includes a number of member states which are not members of the Union, and when we leave the EU, we will remain members of the European Patent Convention, and that will operate in the same way as it does. The European Medicines Agency is a regulatory agency for the approval of medicines for their safety and efficacy, and it's an effort to sort of centralise work which would otherwise be duplicated in individual national agencies. I think that there's logic in proposing that we continue to participate in the European Medicines Agency even after we leave the European Union, since it's one of those technical, I'm not against all technical cooperation with the European Union, and indeed on the other aspect of the question, I would strongly favour us wanting to stay in, for example, the Erasmus student exchange programme and also university research cooperation. And there's actually no real barrier to us doing it as a non-member state. Obviously, we'd have to chip in our share of the cost of staying in the programme. But the EMA, might well be possible to do a deal on that under which we participate in it. If we don't carry on participating in it, my belief is we should look closely at the Swiss drug system. The Swiss, like us, have a very, very strong pharmaceutical sector, and the way they operate their medicines approvals is that they will take into account approvals which are given by any of the major offices, the Food and Drug Administration in the USA, or the Canadian Authority, etc., and will grant authorizations for drugs on the basis of those. So I would favour myself copying very much the Swiss model.
On the subject of academic links and innovation, there's the old joke about a guy trying to get a train to Tewkesbury, and he gets to his station and he says, "What's the best way of getting a train to Tewkesbury?" And the guy at the station said, "Well, I wouldn't start from here, mate." That's a joke. That's laughing at that point. The big advantage we've got is that with all these things, and that's both with things like the EMA and academic links and intelligence and crime prevention links, the thing is we would start from here. So the big difference is that we've got established relationships that work. And so the argument would need to be put forward as to why they should be stripped apart rather than why they should be created. And that's a much higher barrier to jump over. So I suspect that a combination of good old-fashioned inertia and pragmatism would mean that a lot of these relationships, because they are working, will survive the Brexit process. With regard to the clarity for EU nationals working in the UK, there's been a huge amount of opportunistic politicking around this issue. And I have to say that a lot of people have been made to feel very, very uncertain. And for the first time this evening, I'm going to be overtly party political. The Labour Party's actions over this particular issue have been disgraceful. Yeah. They have tried to take party political advantage over, admittedly, this uncertainty. But in doing so, have added a whole load more uncertainty to those people. The Prime Minister has made her position on this absolutely clear, that she wants to be able to protect the status of EU nationals in the UK. We have a moral duty as the British government to protect the status of British nationals in the EU. That has got to be our priority. And if our partners in the EU, the EU 27, if they word for word mirrored the assurance the British Prime Minister has given, then this issue would have gone away instantly. They chose not to. So we held out the olive branch, and they rejected it. So I am absolutely comfortable with the position the British government has taken, because we, without a shadow of a doubt, are the good guys in this particular issue.
In a very question time-esque moment, I'm going to ask for the two final questions, and I'm going to ask each panellist, if they want to comment on it, to just keep it to 1 or 2 sentences, just so I can see you've had your hand up for a long time. And yeah, okay, the two of you, if you'd like to give us your questions.
Supposing we did get a deal, what would be the chances of the European Parliament turning it down because it wants freedom of movement?
Great. And your question, please?
The reference was made to the City of London. Having worked there for a good number of years, it's part of my soul, if you like. It's very important. And at one stage, well before Brexit, there was an issue around the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, for example, trying to claim the status of international stock exchange from London, and London was obviously fighting back. Now, this is a new opportunity for us. I know there are some links now with Frankfurt, but looking longer term, how do you think the city can contribute to that? We talked a lot about balance of payments and services, etc. How can the city contribute to that? How can we engage again with New York Stock Exchange, the Japanese Stock Exchange, etc.? So I'd like to really look at, because you mentioned services in particular, and I think it's very important that we look at that rather than worry about, opening that. Thank you very much.
All right, I will start at the top end and we'll work our way down, and if you try and address both questions, that would be great. Right, you can have a couple of sentences.
So funnily enough, I think, and it may be for other reasons, but there has been a proposed merger between the London Stock Exchange and Deutsche Börse, which seems like it's unravelling, and it feels like it may be because of the current Brexit politics that it's unravelled. But I think to take your a more sort of positive stance, what should the city do maybe post Brexit? Where are its growth opportunities? I think London is already effectively the emerging markets capital of the world when it comes to raising money. I think there are 500 foreign companies listed on the London Stock Exchange. There are more dollars traded in London than in New York. So I think we have to continue to make sure that the city ecosystem, which is quite complex and difficult to replicate, isn't undermined. And that's why I think actually, when it comes to the free trade agreement that we're seeking, I'm not so worried about the trading goods part of it, which actually I think is, frankly, there should be, a way to do it. I think it's the services part, and whether it's equivalence or better mutual recognition, but it's the details of that which I think is going to be, if I'm honest, that is going to have the most dramatic impact on the future of this country, because that's where we earn our crust.
I'll address the first one to begin with in terms of parliamentary scrutiny. If I go back to the comments that I made, ultimately the decision on accepting the Brexit deal is going to be between the Council of Ministers, i.e. the various member states, heads of states, whoever they might be after the various elections, and the Commission. Now, the decision to refer it to the European Union Parliament was something that the previous president of the Parliament, Schulz, with Verhofstadt, forced through. I think what you can expect, there'll be loads of hand-wringing. We'll probably have to sit through at least 2 days of each MEP wanting to stand up and give a minute and a half's worth of, whatever, how bad it is or how good it is. But ultimately, we're not going to have any power to turn it down. It's as simple as that. It's going to be a decision taken way above our head. The other point of that is that the new president, in Italian, much more conciliatory, wants a good deal with the United Kingdom, doesn't want to penalise the United Kingdom for leaving, so I expect something positive out of that. In terms of the second question, just some comments really, some observations. In the last few days, the German Finance Minister, Mr. Schwab, has come out with some very conciliatory statements. Quote, the EU needs to recognise that the City of London's global status as the financial capital, and if I might just add, Frankfurt sits number 7 in terms of the global standing, and Paris is 14th. Where are you going to put your money if you're a finance or an investment company? You're not going to take it out of the proper, the key place. That's it.
I'm going to say something really weird, but bear with me. Free movement is not necessarily, sorry, who asked this? So, free movement clauses are not necessarily a deal breaker in international trade deals. Okay? Free movement of people within the EU was not a problem when there were only about 13 members. Because the GDP per capita of those members was quite close. GDP per capita of the UK is about $38,000 per head. GDP of France is about $38,000 per head. So actually, there's pretty normal flows from the UK and France. That wouldn't be a problem. The problem came about when we started or when the EU expanded to encompass countries with very different GDP per capita. So for example, we've got 38,000 per capita, Romania's got 18,000 per capita. There is an inevitable draw from the lower per capita economy to the higher per capita economy. If we were to do free trade deals with countries with similar GDP per capita, a free trade clause would make very little difference. British people, take Australia for example, British people might want to go to Australia, Australians might want to come here, it won't make very much difference, it won't put a whole amount of pressure. The problem comes when there are big differentials. So if deals require some element, whether it's with the EU or with other countries, some element of free movement, as long as that GDP per capita differential is taken into consideration, I'm not going to say an automatic veto on that. It would need to be on a case-by-case basis. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a deal breaker. With the EU, particularly with the Eastern European countries, it is currently a problem. But there may well be a workaround with, I don't know, certain income levels or whatever that may give us an option. So we'll see how it plays out on that one. The other one about financial services. I love it when Frankfurt is highlighted as a potential competitor to London. A very good friend of mine, I won't embarrass him by naming names, but he's a very successful guy. And he works in a German bank in the UK. And he said to me, and I quote, "What's the point in being rich if you have to spend the money in Frankfurt?" London is the financial services capital, certainly of Europe. So the City of London is number one, Canary Wharf is number two, so we get the top two in Europe. The combination of the city and Canary Wharf gets us nibbling at number one in the world. But more importantly, we're one of the cultural capitals of the world. We're one of the arts capitals of the world. London, and it's ironically what makes sometimes some friction within the UK economy is actually very good globally. So lots of people outside London moan that so much is centralised in London: media, arts, politics, financial services, etc., etc., etc. In terms of our global competitiveness, that really gives us a big advantage. And finally, my final point for tonight, I said earlier on about the political discipline imposed by Brexit over immigration policy. The other discipline that will be imposed upon us by Brexit is we will have to get out of the habit of slagging off the financial services industry because it pays the bills. Germany would never slate its manufacturing industry. France would never slate its agricultural industry. Italy would never slate its luxury goods sector. We've got to get out of the habit of beating up the financial services sector every time there's a bit of bad news on the economic horizon, because it is absolutely core to our national economic success. And we're going to have to get much better at praising people who sometimes screw up, but whose economic activity pays the bills.
First question, what happens if the European Parliament turns down the deal? Actually, it's a little bit more complicated. The European Parliament is required to approve the agreement on withdrawal under Article 50. That's in Article 50 itself. I'm not going to enter into predictions. I hope Diane's right that they will all turn into pussycats under their nice new Italian president. But obviously we have to be ready for that possibility, unless until they actually vote. So we have to carry on planning right up to the last minute on the basis of no deal. And then if there is a deal and it goes through hunky-dory, that's fine. It's actually more complicated in relation to an agreement on our future relationship between us and the European Union, because although many aspects of those are within the powers of the European Union to conclude, some aspects of it are likely to be not in the European Union's powers, but only within the powers of the individual member states. And therefore those aspects of the agreement will need to be approved not only by the European Parliament, but also may require approval by each member state in accordance with its own constitutional requirements before it can come into force. This is a problem which was encountered by Canada because of its huge free trade agreement with the European Union, and the Belgians turned out, they didn't like it, the Romanians didn't like it for different reasons, etc. So we have to be very careful to try and avoid this by putting the core trading parts of our future relationship into an agreement which is clearly within the powers of the European Union to agree and doesn't involve member state competencies. Second question, future of the city. Let's look at it positively. One of the problems that the city has been facing over the past few years has been a torrent of regulatory output from Brussels, which, to put it kindly, if not designed to screw up the city as a world financial centre, has been imposed by a majority voting system in which the majority who are voting don't have the same sympathy with financial services as we do in this country. And one of the big positives of leaving the European Union is no longer to be subject to these sort of regulatory incursions.
That ends our evening. I'll hope you bear with me for just 2 more minutes while I make a few thanks to the people without whom this evening would not have been possible. So firstly to the committee of the Northwood Conservatives. There are too many to name, but if you could just put your hands up and give a little wave so everyone knows who's been part of it. Thank you to all of you. Thank you also to the friends and family who I guess were essentially honorary members of the committee, filming and flyering and selling tickets, so thank you to all of you. I'm not sure if she's in the room, but thank you to Rachel, who has been the most amazing person at organising and helping us host this event. If any of you want to host an event, could not recommend the London School of Theology and Rachel more. I would like to give a special thanks to each of our speakers. I'm sure you'll agree with me, they have all shared their insights, experiences, thoughts with us in a most insightful way, and I for one have really enjoyed this evening, so thank you to all 4 of you. And finally, thank you to each and every one of you. I know, your time is precious. We appreciate 2 hours of it this evening. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the event. We do loads more of these, so do sign up or get in touch if you would like to hear about them. And, pat on the back and a round of applause to all of you for sitting through. Oh, and there's crisps and drinks outside if anyone wants a snack on their way out.
Can I just stop for a minute? I'd just like to say a word. Can we all say thank you to Rashaan? Who's put so much work Thank you for coming.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm still not this. I didn't notice it. Awesome.
without so Andrew said that he's taken that. By the time everybody's got out,